correctional system aims to protect the public by deterring crime and removing and rehabilitating those who commit it. The privatization of prisons started when prisons became overcrowded. So the claim I'm going to respond to is that privatization of prisons is counterproductive. My opponent's secondary claims were one, that privatization of prisons fails in decreasing in crime rate, two, that privatization has led to a decrease in conditions of these facilities, and three, that it fails to be cost effective. So, back to our first claim, that privatization of prisons fails in decreasing crime rate. So as my opponent touched on, recidivism is a tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend. So prisons usually have rehab programs to prevent this, but there's just simply not enough room in the state's budget anymore for these programs. So a lot of states have been kind of stripping these away. And California is one of these states that have had to do away with most of the rehab programs over the years. So for example, in 2010, CDCR had to cut back on a lot of their rehab programs because they had a budget cut of $2.1 billion. So it's not necessarily the privatization prison's fault for the failing to decrease crime rate. It's the shortage of budgets to provide these resources. Point two, that privatization has led to a decrease in conditions of these facilities. Actually, state and federal prisons have equal, if not higher, worse conditions in their facilities in comparison to private prisons. For example, the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama. So Julia Tutwiler is an Alabama educator, or was an Alabama educator and crusader for inmate education, classification, and for improving conditions. So on the Alabama Department of Corrections website, it lists that this facility has mental health unit, has medical infirmary, and it has special units for pregnant women and older women, and that it has a substance abuse program, which is like a rehab program. But this facility has one of the highest rates of sexual assault among the U.S. for correctional facilities for women. So this facility was put under investigation after a couple accusations from the inmates, and the findings were that a lot of inmates were being raped and sexually harassed, and that there were a lot of officers who were underreporting a lot of incidents. And after inmates would speak out to reporters, and after the investigation was over, a lot of the inmates were punished by, they were segregated from other inmates, and they were, a lot of their stuff was taken from them, and they couldn't contact their family, and they were punished for speaking out on being abused. And the only repercussion that the facility faced was that the warden was replaced. That's about it. And the report also concluded that the facility was not conducted to managing a female population, and that the actual physical facility was very dirty. It wasn't clean. It wasn't kept up, and that sanitation was not a standard there, and it does not reinforce physical or personal safety for inmates or staff. So privatization prisons supposedly cut back on different amenities that public prisons have, but privatization prison conditions aren't any worse than public prisons. So the third point, privatization fails to be cost effective. So this can't be proven, because to calculate these costs you need to include capital costs, monitor costs, and other costs. But these private companies aren't required to release many of their details of their costs and their services that they provide. So the Government Accountability Office has concluded multiple times that the data is not sufficient to definitely claim that either type of prison is more cost effective. So there was a bunch of studies comparing private and then public prisons, and they were just all back and forth. There was no sufficient data that proved one was cheaper than the other, or basically the data was inconclusive. So My opponent claims that privatization of prisons is counterproductive because they fail in decreasing crime rates, lead to decreasing facility conditions, and fail to be cost effective. I've shown you that the lack of funding is the reason for crime rate not decreasing, and that the state and federal facilities have the same, if not worse, conditions in their facilities, and that there is no sufficient data to prove that private prisons are any cheaper.
All right, Vanessa, I think the summary is basically the strongest part of your argument. If you could finish it off with by speaking to us a little bit more directly, I think you'd be a lot more convincing. Your arguments come down to a series of counterclaims on each of the advocates' claims. There's a lack of money. That's the real problem on that first point. It's not the prisons themselves. It's a lack of money that's available. That there isn't a substantial difference between the quality of the prisons, and in fact, there's good reason to believe that the government-owned prisons have more problems than the privately owned prisons, and that we don't know and can't assess the cost differences, which is, the main criticism that the advocate's presenting on that third point, and we just don't have the data to do that. So if you can't tell what the difference is, and there's, the source of the problems that exist are something other than the private prisons, it's awfully hard to blame them. That's kind of the way that the argument should go. And I think you are on the brink of saying it that way and making a very forceful point. The problem is that it gets a little convoluted in the body of the speech because you spend a lot of time covering some information that I'm not sure how important it is. So the cutting of the, like on the first point, the cutting of the budget for California's prisons, I think that that's pretty good. There's a good piece of information there that talks about how they had to cut $2.1 billion in 2010. So that's a good piece of information. It's your assertion that it's all the rehab programs that got cut. I do think something that would be a little bit more explicit in particular on that would be helpful there. Again, we don't have any comparative information on what the advocate's evidence was. This is one of the things that's a little problematic because when you're working on your argument, you need to also work on their argument a little bit, and I don't see much information that deals with that first point and the information that they use to present their particular point. On the second point, you rely on a single example of a prison in Alabama with deteriorating conditions and a lack of resources, and certainly it's problematic. And you're saying, so it's like, well, the state and the federal prisons are problematic too. I think that's a pretty good example of that. I don't know how generalizable it is, but I also don't know how to make a comparison to what the advocate's evidence was. Were their harms as significant as the ones that you document here? If they're not, then that would be a reason to believe that the private prisons were a little bit better, but we don't really get any comparison. And then on that third point, you basically come down to saying there's just not enough information on this kind of thing. I think when people are faced with this issue, especially state legislators, they look and they say, well, you have to think about what the costs are. The costs are building a new prison to hold X number of prisoners, or farming them out at this expense that it's going to be annual. And maybe building a new prison would be cost competitive over 15 to 20 years, but if you've got tight budgets like we have now, where we're cutting $2.1 billion, then maybe the idea of farming them out to prisons that are already existent and not being used, and they're underutilized, and the private companies are taking care of them, that might be cost competitive, that sort of thing. So I think there's a larger picture to make here. I don't care if the companies make money on it. I care if the state's saving money, and that's the place that you need to look at it. So I think that that's probably where the argument is more likely to be found. All right, thank you. Dakota.